Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Binkhorsts and Blockbusters. I'm Garrett,
And I'm Kate.
and we're starting our horror-themed spooktacular with John Carpenter's The Thing.
Yeah, our grand plans for October were ruined by delays in a certain feature film. So we've decided to go with a spooky theme for the month of October and hit on some classics, The Thing being one of them, and hopefully some other good horror movies. It's kind of interesting to me because I used to be a huge horror movie fan, like in high school and middle school. Like I was into The Ring and Saw and like all those movies. And now, like, as you're gonna listen in this podcast, they are not my thing anymore.
Yeah, the Thing is one of those that I'd always known about, and then when I finally sat down and watched it, I got a lot of the appeal. I've never been big into horror movies until more recently, and I definitely like the more artistic and interesting ones over something that's just blood and guts like the Saw movies or things with stupid jump scares. I hate jump scares. They're bad filmmaking. I'm gonna say it. That's my official stance.
Yeah, not a fan of jump scares. I think that they're useful in a film. I think that like movies like Alien does it well. Because they do create, suspense. Same thing with Jaws, but I do think that they can be way overused.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act, but I think this film ends up doing suspense and all that without having the use of jump scares. One was cut from the movie because it was deemed too cheesy by our director, John Carpenter. So
I
you,
can't believe they edited anything out for being too cheesy.
well, this film had a lot of things cut, added, and changed over the course of its production and in subsequent releases. And we'll talk about quite a few of those. But
Okay,
but first, there's been a strike update.
cool.
Uh, so today, at the time of the recording, is September 21st, and today and yesterday, the Writers Guild of America and the Alliance of Motion Pictures and Television Producers, they've issued a joint statement that they have met for bargaining.
Cool.
Yeah, that's it. That's our strike update. Today marks the 142nd day of the Writers Guild strike.
Well, hopefully by the time this podcast is released, the strike will be over and everybody will be paid living wages and everything will be wonderful and there'll be rainbows in the sky and unicorns walking down the street. But I'll leave those for hopes for the future.
Yeah, we'll see.
Sorry if I threw you with that that future hopeful assessment there, but
It was a lot. We'll have to see the pessimism of Garrett in post production. No pessimism here. The strike for the writers is now over.
yeah, that'll be fun. Hi Garrett in post production. I hope I was correct.
You were. Congratulations. To get into our feature for this week, The Thing was released in 1982 by John Carpenter. Previously, he got big off of making the first Halloween movie with Michael Myers and Escape from New York. Later, he would make Escape from Los Angeles, Big Trouble in Little China, uh, Christie. I think he had already made The Fog at this point. He goes on to make a number of movies. However, this became a big turning point in his career because it did not perform well at the box office and was panned by a lot of critics. It later gained a cult following on release, like a lot of the movies we talk about, but initially it did not do well. So it had a budget of $15 million, which wasn't a lot. I think compared today, that's about $45 million. and it brought in domestically less than 20 million. So it probably made back everything, but that's not really what they're looking for in the movie world. We need things to make tons of money. Um, a couple factors that attributed to it is E.T. had come out at the same time, and that's a much more optimistic look at aliens, a lot more family friendly. Um, at this time in America, there was a recession going on, so people weren't as inclined to go see the nihilistic, terrifying thing. Instead, wanted to see the happy little alien.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes we forget like when movies come out in the past and how much that affects, what's going on. And yeah, I definitely see E.T. as a Spielberg being like more dominant in the box office.
Oh yeah, that movie I think made like $600 million. It made a ton. Um, Also coming out the same day was Blade Runner.
Holy crap.
Yeah, 1982 was an interesting year. Other people claim that the film didn't perform well because of a really oversaturated market with sci-fi stuff. The Poltergeist series was just coming up. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan had just come out. Mad Max 2, Tron, uh, I think Conan the Barbarian and some other, what would become cult movies were also coming out around that time. This was the 80s. A lot of movies we talk about are going to be from or around then, because movies were just being made at an incredibly rapid rate back then.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting to put that into perspective because so many of those movies are movies that I love. I mean, and would watch again and again.
Yeah, I think whenever we get around to talking about something like Pulp Fiction, we'll come to find that that year, there were tons of other movies that were coming out, and because it always pisses me off that Forrest Gump won the Best Picture that year against like even The Shawshank Redemption, I think came out that year. There was just a ton of great stuff. So
Yeah.
this was another great year in movie history. So you might know that The Thing is based off of a book called Who Goes There. It was written in 1938 by John W. Campbell Jr. Um, this, along with H.P. Lovecraft, are cited as some of John Carpenter's like bigger influences in filmmaking. He goes on to make a trilogy of films. One is called In the Mountain of Madness, which is one of H.P. Lovecraft's books, but he takes a lot of like themes and ideas from there. Um, so the movie is kind of a remake, a re-envisioning of a 1951 movie, The Thing from Another World, that was based off of the book as well. This is one of John Carpenter's most favorite movies. He even includes it in the his original film Halloween, where people are watching that on the television. Uh, he was approached later on in the development of this film as attached to direct. Initially, it was going to be directed by Toby Hooper of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but Universal weren't happy. Also, John Landis was approached. You might know him from Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and the terrible helicopter incident on the Twilight Zone film.
Ooh, yeah.
Uh, so a lot of things were working against this movie from the people that were attached in the 70s. So that's why it didn't come about into the 80s. Partially because of the success of Alien, that revitalized a lot of things in the sci-fi world and gave Universal more hope that this movie would succeed. Uh,
Cool. Yeah, that's interesting that you talked earlier about, this being like so many big sci-fi movies and the market was oversaturated, but it was oversaturated because all the studios were like, "Hey, sci-fi movies are cool."
yeah, and this is in the era of, the after the success of Star Wars too. Um,
Mm,
I
yeah.
think I don't even think the Return of the Jedi had come out yet in '82. I think that was later in the '80s. Um, This series, The Thing, has gone on to spawn tons of stuff. There are comic books and tie-in board games and video games. There's also a prequel to this film that was released in 2011 that stars Mary Elizabeth Winstead, and that's a prequel to this movie. It recreates many of the key scenes from the Norwegian camp that we see through the environmental storytelling when Kurt Russell and the Doctor go through it. Um, and it forgoes a lot of the practical effects that you see in this film for CGI effects that were um, not really ahead of their time. 2011 is a rough area for CGI because there are a lot of things that look great, but it's nowhere near what it is today, even just 10 years later.
Hmm.
They were going to use practical effects in the Thing 2011, but there are just a variety of factors that were working against them. Some things did get made, but for the most part, they just relied on CGI. Uh,
Yeah.
Two other projects have been announced in the past that are direct sequels from this. Frank Darabont, who directed a few Stephen King movies, The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile. He's also one of the producers on The Walking Dead, was going to make a miniseries for the Sci-Fi Channel. That never happened. Um, and then in the early 2020s, Blumhouse Productions said they were working with John Carpenter to make a direct sequel to The Thing based on an alternate version of the book. Um, they had found like more manuscript or something like that that added something to the end, like it was either an alternate ending to the book or just more information to who goes there. So we'll get more of it someday.
Yeah, yeah, and thinking about all of these iterations of the thing and the idea, I mean, it's not a uncommon idea in sci-fi just in general. Like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Puppet Masters by Robert Heinlein were both very similar concepts where you have, I guess we'll go into some spoilers about the plot. You have some kind of like contagious being thing. You have a contagion that causes people to not be themselves and then, cause havoc. Um, and I think that, it's interesting that that is something that just comes up over and over again in sci-fi. And I think a lot of it has to do with like the themes of alienation and like like people being not who they seem and those kinds of concepts which are, terrifying. Like you wake up one day and your wife is not your wife anymore. But there's somebody else. And I mean, I guess there's also like common psychoses that you can go through that, you know, are very similar.
Yeah, well, even in a lot of really modern and more mainstream stuff, like we've mentioned before, the new Disney Plus show, the Marvel show, Secret Invasion, where there's a whole race of people that blend into the American world and like are taking the place of people using their shape shifting abilities. Like this is a very like scary idea, and I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I think it's another thing that happens a lot with like, in the context of war and spycraft, where you have people who, are not who they say they are, and that being such a predominant theme in a lot of content just in general, in different eras. Like you said that book was written in the 30s, right?
yeah, 38.
Yeah, so like that's the time of, Nazi spies. And then, the first version of this movie coming out in the 50s, that's the time of Soviet spies. And, like I think that, this idea that there might be aliens among us, is horrifying and, terrifying, and it makes for a good horror movie.
Absolutely. So there are a couple things that I think make this movie stand out in terms of being scary. And the first one is isolation. So this film takes place in an Antarctica research station that has lost radio contact from other stations or places for the last 2 weeks. This was filmed partially in Juneau, Alaska, and British Columbia, but also on refrigerated sets in Los Angeles.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that the isolation is a huge angle to this. But on one hand, it's a con, and like being isolated is scary, and being alone, but they are in kind of a large group for being isolated. And two, it creates a good plot device in that, they are alone. They're not in a city like this alien thing, can't go that far away and escape. In theory, like that's one of the plots, is them trying to kill it because they don't want it to get out and escape and kill other people.
Yeah, so they find well, they find an alien creature, but they don't quite realize it because it's disguised. It's among them. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, so like, do we, I don't know if we want to get into things I don't like right now, but
um, I I don't see why not.
okay. So, the big issue that I had pretty early on was that like they find this, like the whole first scene is very like, I kind of like the first scene, but it's confusing as to what's going on. Fine, whatever. But then you have this they find this like crazy creature thing, like that looks insane. Like you see the shots of it and you're like, what the hell? And then they decide to take it back to camp with them?
Okay, okay, yes. So they end up going to one of the Norwegian research station that was like savaged by the Thing's attacks, and then they bring back a thing um that turns out to still be alive. Yeah, I think that's a bit crazy, but
Yeah, I mean,
so
not
like
having like a quarantine protocol for such a bizarre thing just bothers me. And I mean, I don't know if that's the 2023, post-COVID person talking, or if like these people are idiots or like what.
so I think we have to make like a big asterisk with every time we talk about horror movies is that horror movies only work if somebody is doing something irrational, right? Like they make one comment about it that like, oh, studying this thing, whatever it is, could win somebody like a Nobel Prize, but like that's I if I see a crazy abomination, I'm going the other way. I don't want any part of it.
Yeah, or just like leave it there so you can study it later. Like everybody at the Norwegian camp was dead. Like you could just like leave it there and move on or come back later. I mean, it's not going anywhere, like but yeah, I get what you're saying about the irrational behavior here. But I mean, I don't think that's true of all horror movies. So like, but I mean, maybe we can test that in Spookytober or whatever. Um, yeah.
So I think that the really limited location and that the effect of them being trapped and later sabotaged to be permanently trapped really hones them in on, well, we have to deal with this like it's their responsibility. Um, Whereas if you think of like another horror movie or like horror concepts of like, oh, they're being a slasher killer, like why wouldn't you just keep running and make it not your problem anymore? Um, here, here they have a very definitive like, well, we're gonna die no matter what out here. We might as well kill this thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I just have so many problems with this movie, so keep going.
Okay. Um, One thing that I think this film does really well is it highlights one of the biggest fears that everyone has, which is fear of the unknown. Um, as soon as it's established what the monster can do, which is basically like take over and replace people, mimic biology, uh, do things like that, everybody becomes on edge. They are worried that their friends who they've been around for months at this point aren't who they say they are, that they could be next, that maybe they're the only one that's, left normal. Um, there's also a fear of like, uh, as an audience, we don't see everything that happens. If you want to put together like a timeline of who got assimilated or who got killed or who was doing X, Y, and Z or what the monster was up to, you probably have to watch the movie a couple times because not everything is spelled out to you. There are a lot of hints. There are a lot of red herrings as well. It's really interesting to look at that movie or to look at the movie to try to understand like the full timeline of events. It is a little obtuse. It is hard due to some reshoots, especially for the end. Some themes or some like I guess motif would be a better word. They kind of get lost. Um, for a while, people said that there was a glint in people's eyes who weren't the thing, and this has been stated by the cinematographer that that was true, but then omitted in some scenes. Um, and some people have really insane theories like the thing doesn't have a breath, but everybody has a breath because they're on these refrigerated sets. And the thing can like remake organs and stuff that work. So I don't know. It's very
Yeah.
strange.
Yeah, I love the idea of fans coming up with these kind of theories as they watch it over and over, especially ones that aren't intended by the creators. I just think that's a cool part of cinema. I did notice, like, and I wasn't sure if it was just like bad cinematography or like purposeful, but I did notice a shimmer. Like sometimes, you know how like the telltale shimmer of the Predator?
Yeah.
I saw something like that a few times and I thought that had something to do with it, but I don't know.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an interesting issue there. And I mean, the fear of the unknown is terrifying. And I think that, being on a base, with these people, and they joke about, the going crazy issue a couple times. And yeah, so
Yeah, because when the Norwegians come in and they're like shooting at this dog and their planes loaded with explosives, they're like, oh yeah, maybe they just went crazy and went on like a killing spree. Like that isn't out of the question. Um,
yeah, but they never wondered why they were shooting at the dog.
yeah, that's something that again I think is um, a very stupid thing. Like I think any because a bunch of people were watching that happen, like they'd be like, yeah, why are they trying to kill this dog? That's very important because like dogs can carry diseases. If like let's say everybody got like wiped out by some disease and they were like killing the dogs so it didn't spread to like this camp, then like that would be a very noble thing to do. But because we have the language barrier, we don't get that scene. Um,
Yeah. Well, and I mean, just yeah, the complete lack of acknowledgement that that could be an issue was just like really took me off guard.
yeah. We see Blair, who's probably one of the most level-headed people. When he realizes that the dog's just been roaming around camp the whole time, he becomes like immediately suspicious of Clark, the dog wrangler, who
Hmm.
just kind of let him do that all day. Um, but
Yeah.
dogs are a man's best friend. Like I think any person would have some guilt or apprehension towards killing a dog. Like
Yeah, and I think that they did a good job of like having like one guy who cared and loved the dogs and put it gave them attention and that kind of thing in order to create that empathetic response that we see in a lot of other movies like I Am Legend
yeah.
has the dog dying in I Am Legend is a big deal for everybody.
So the actor who plays Clark worked very closely with the on-set dogs that were there, as well as the dogs that were a part of the dog thing prosthetic, to
Mhm.
be more comfortable around them, and for them to be more comfortable around him. A nice little touch. Uh, they say in Hollywood not to work with children or animals, and the animals in this I think do a really great job, even when it's the Thing dog being in the kennel with the other dogs. It still seems like it's acting a whole lot differently, which
Yeah, yeah. I think that the animal handlers on this one did a good job, and I think that it helps that there are huskies and these more, I don't want to say trainable, but like they're just their behavior just is a really nice touch to the story and all that.
yeah. Shall we talk about our action hero, Kurt Russell?
Yeah, action hero Kurt Russell is a favorite. I think he's going to be a friend of the pod. We come back to him again and again, especially as we watch Escape from New York and Big Trouble in Little China. I'm sure will come up again in the future. But I mean, his hair in this movie, truly dreamy.
Oh, fantastic. He grew it out a year for this production.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of my other problems with this movie is that all of the other actors and like the writing and the line delivery and everything like that kind of sucked. And not that Kurt Russell had a lot of lines or delivered them well, but like at least he had like a personality to him that was like something.
Yeah, so the supporting cast of characters is full of people, and in a very similar way to Alien, they're all lesser known actors. Even Wilford Brimley, who's in here at that point, was not a very well known name. Um, but they're meant to be like average people, working Joes, that type of thing. But I will agree. I don't think any of it is particularly well acted.
Yeah, and I think that like it kind of like blew my mind in the sense of like why are these people working on this scientific, thing? Like what are they doing? Like we didn't really get that kind of background because like these guys don't seem like academics and scientists. And
No, there
and they don't seem to be like military dudes.
there's one line that references Kurt Russell as being like a past military guy, but he flies the helicopter, and this is in the 80s, so like he could have flown in Vietnam or something.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Like, but I mean, it's not a military base,
right.
these aren't, active duty guys. There's a couple doctors, there's a couple guys that just like the guy who does the radio, like smokes a bunch of weed. Like, it doesn't like I didn't get a sense of like why they were there or what they were doing or anything like that.
Yeah, it's very much the Arctic base is very much like just a framing device. They don't really expand on what they were doing. In the prequel, the 2011 prequel, it's immediately established that they're down there to study like the alien thing, and I feel like that gives them a little bit more leeway. But here, who knows what the hell they're doing? I don't know what they do in the real world down there. I don't know what there is to learn.
Yeah, I mean maybe like there it's some kind of like oil drilling operation or something like that. I mean that is the only like kind of job that I can think of that would put all these people together. But I don't know. That part, threw me. There's no female characters, that's there are,
Well,
some brown people. That's nice, yeah. And I understand why you don't want females, on your lonely Arctic base also. Like that makes
yes.
so I'm not like upset about it, but like it was just like a bunch of weird white guys hanging out with these two black guys and some dogs.
So we talked a little bit about media literacy last time, and I read some like really crazy hot takes about the fact that all these people are men in this movie, and it being like there's a subtext that like the thing is a metaphor or something for homosexuality, and how like it's among them, but the only way to know that it was there would be through this like intimacy with another person that does not exist between men. Not like physical intimacy, but more like emotional and understanding and be able to talk to each other that's not there. I don't know. There were some hot takes about it. They're all pretty garbage.
Yeah, I think that that is nuts. I think it's more likely that it's a metaphor about Soviets, commies. There's commies among us.
Yes. So
Right.
that I definitely think is part of the 51 film of it being, a metaphor there, but also here in this era, I think works just as well. Um,
Yeah. But I mean, Kurt Russell, he does a good job in this film. He's our hero. He looks actiony. He looks like he could save the day. Comes up with some good ideas in
yes.
general.
He also has sunglasses, which is a big key for action heroes. You have to have sunglasses.
Yeah.
And he has plenty of weapons. On screen, he has a shotgun, but in the film, he usually wields a flamethrower. He also has Clark's pocket knife and the I want to say he was like a ranger or some kind of like military police dude because he had a pistol and I think he had a badge. He was like the security chief.
Mhm.
Um, he also carries around a bunch of dynamite, which is the most badass thing.
Yeah. Yeah, which makes me wonder what were they using the dynamite for? I don't know.
So,
It's very bizarre.
so the flamethrower makes sense because you would have to be melting ice off of stuff almost constantly. Um, Guns would make sense if they were at the North Pole because of polar bears, but in the South Pole, all they would have are um, penguins. Those aren't that dangerous.
Right.
Uh, Dynamite, I don't know why they would have dynamite at all.
Yeah, I mean, unless they're doing some kind of like mining or drilling or something like that, dynamite might make sense.
So one thing that I think is really weird is in a lot of horror movies, and definitely ones we'll talk about, like in Alien, in The Shining, hell, even in Titanic, like all of those movies have very defined spaces, and like from almost the beginning, like the full extent of the space that this movie is going to be taking place. And
Mhm.
then the last act of this movie just takes place underground in like an area that's been there the whole time that's just full of stuff. And I have always thought that was really weird and kind
Yeah.
of like opposite the rest of the movie, which takes place in like the metal pristine hallways, like full of junk and stuff. Like that really took me out. It was very confusing.
Yeah, yeah, the senses of space in this movie were hard. Even in the like hallways of the different rooms, like if you think about it, like this little like station shouldn't be that complicated. It should have like a mess hall, a hanging out area, some sciencey areas, like the radio room, the bunk rooms. Kurt Russell has his own shack off to the side. Like that should all be pretty clear to us as we're watching this movie, like the map of it in our heads. But we just didn't get that at all.
No, and I feel like you could look at it as, almost like a thematic angle of like confusion, but I don't think it works well in that regard either. It certainly doesn't work as well as The Shining does, where
Hmm.
where that space becomes a character in itself.
Yeah. Well, and also like when they go to the underground area, it wasn't like it was like one of the underground areas was like a surprise. But the other one, it seemed like they knew it was there. It was like a storage area.
Yeah, and it had the generator.
Yeah, and it wasn't like a surprise. So, yeah, it just that part didn't work for me. Put it on the list.
Yeah. Um, Before we move on from our character portion, I want to talk about some alternate castings.
Oh, geez.
So,
Give me Al Pacino.
uh, I'll do you one better. Christopher Walken.
Oh,
He was possibly going to be in this, maybe as McCready. So Kurt Russell was working with John Carpenter on this before he was cast. He was actually one of the last people to be cast in the movie, which is kind of strange because he is the face of this movie, I think. Um,
Yeah, this movie would not work without Kurt Russell. And I'm not saying it works well with him, but it would not work at all without him.
yeah. So Kurt Russell worked with John Carpenter on Escape from New York quite recently. So they were, friends and always in talks. And he's in Escape from LA, Big Trouble in Little China, probably a couple other of his movies. Um, Also, just possible casts were Jeff Bridges. He was really big at this time, especially with Tron, and Ed Harris
Oh, yeah.
to play Childs, who is the last remaining character, along with Kurt Russell, possibly played by Carl Weathers or Ernie Hudson of Ghostbusters fame.
Hmm.
Uh, Palmer, the stoner character, who I think has something to do with maintenance, could have been played by Jay Leno.
That would have been something.
Yes. Um,
Of course, I
something
like I don't know what Jay Leno looked like in the 80s. I only know what he looked like, 5 years ago. So,
he always has looked like that.
okay.
He was born with the big chin.
Oh dear.
Um so Gary, who is our ranger cop dude, he takes charge at the beginning but relinquishes control over to Kurt Russell. Could have been played by Powers Booth, who is Cy Tolliver from Deadwood.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
that would have worked. And I because I thought that character was kind of weenie, like, like he didn't, stand up for anybody, and he shot the Norwegian guy before, like, he could have told them anything. So,
yeah.
like, yeah,
Um,
I wasn't a fan of him as a character.
Also, and this is something that I don't see brought up in any discussion, he goes with Kurt Russell and Blair to the Norwegian camp, but he's just like not seen investigating it at all, which
Oh, yeah,
is very strange. But then he's that would lead, I think, a lot of people to think he was assimilated at some point while he was there, but that turns out not to be the case.
right, yeah.
Um, I think that character that there are several scenes in this movie that I think are meant to be like red herrings for, well, somebody's not here, what are they doing? And then when it turns out they weren't doing nothing, that didn't mean anything, kind of feels a little wasted. Um, I think if there was like a cop or like a guard or something, they would want to get to the bottom of like what the hell happened here more so than the doctor and the helicopter pilot.
Yeah, but I mean, like, there's a conceivable universe where he's like guarding the helicopter, But I mean, that also like adds to his like weenie quality of like not being a good cop. And I think that, that's what gives Kurt Russell like the ability to be the main character too.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely understand that. Yeah, we like we said, we can't have everybody making rational decisions or the movie doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, the rational decision would have been to shoot the dog, well, and maybe even if they didn't shoot the dog. So like not shooting the dog, or shooting the dog, not shooting the Norwegian would have been more rational, or like shooting him in the foot. Um, and then like not bringing the thing back to camp, like that was pretty dumb. But it had already infected the dog, so the thing would have got there anyway, and like, yeah. So there's that. I don't know. It's hard to map the irrational decisions that were made here, but not quarantining is one of them.
Yeah, them not being as inquisitive as they probably ought to be was their downfall.
Hmm.
Um, that's really all I have to talk about with Kurt Russell.
Yeah, I don't have anything other to say.
Okay.
I liked his hair.
His hair is pretty damn great.
Mhm.
So another huge part of this movie are the special effects, particularly those revolving around the Thing monster. Um, so there are 4 or 5 different creatures that they made for the film. including the dog thing, um, uh, Thing Blair. They all have really dumb names. This head that you see on screen, and the kind of like melty face that Palmer becomes.
Yeah,
Um,
and there's like the original thing that they pull out of the Norwegians too, I
yeah,
think.
and that was two Norwegians fused together
Yeah.
as some crazy assimilation.
Yeah,
Um,
and this is like directly opposite to a lot of the other movies where we talked about where they don't show you the thing, they make you imagine it. And in this one they show you. They show you in great detail. And it's gross.
yeah. Um, so the special effects were made by Rob Bottin, and he spent about a tenth of the $15 million budget on these creature effects. Um, that was about double what Universal Studios gave them for the creature effects budget. But I think it was worth it. I really like these effects. I think even now they still look crazy. Some of them don't hold up as well, but like I think it looks better than, a dodgy attempt at CGI. They're also
Yeah,
very fun.
especially during these years, like CGI in these years. I mean, 2 years later, we have Dune, and those CGI effects I will speak in great length about in future. But yeah, like I'm glad they went with practical effects. I just thought everything was gross. And like as opposed to like Alien, where like it's gross, but you can find like some real like beauty in it and like interesting imagery and stuff. This is just gross.
Yeah. Uh, the grossness and violence of a lot of this turned a lot of people off of the film just in general. Like they couldn't get past that to be able to see like, the amazing achievements in like puppetry and creative arts that it takes to make this. Um the Blair thing, or this isn't Blair. I forget who this character's name is. Um but this like detached head took them months to make, so it looked good. In the past on this show, we've talked about miniatures, and there was only one miniature that was made for this, and that was for the Blair thing at the end. And John Carpenter saw it, saw what it looked like and how it worked, and was like, "This isn't good enough for what we're doing." So only a couple shots exist of that in the movie,
Mhm.
because it was like a stop motion thing. The real Blair thing puppet took 50 people to operate.
Oh
So
wow.
just crazy.
Yeah.
Um, in a few years, we'd see Jabba the Hutt, which is another huge puppet, and I think that took like 6 or 8 people to operate. Um, just tons of really advanced puppets in this.
Yeah, and I think that, they were interesting and unique and on all those things. I think that one of my issues with them and in this movie, and you can see it in the slide that's on the screen, is the bad lighting. It took this like it's just so like jarring and harsh that I think that it makes it look much more artificial than if they would have done some like softer lighting or something. Like I don't know, like they could have done something slightly different that would have made me like it a lot more.
Right. One of the things in early CGI was to have the CGI stuff in the dark. Particularly Jurassic Park did this because it's a lot harder to kind of like distinguish the background from the edges of the CGI thing. If they were to make some of the shots with this monster, particularly when they're in the operating room, darker, I think it would have worked a lot better because the thing looks very glossy all the time,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but that just highlights its like artificialness.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think there's a difference between a glossy alien that's made out of like an exoskeleton, kind of like a shell of a beetle, and this like glossy skin. Like it's just not it's not giving it to me.
Right. Um, so a lot of these things were made with rubber. That was one of the like big primary things. It allowed them to do a lot of the expanding and contracting work with the mechanical parts. But some of our favorites return from Alien. The technology here really doesn't change. They used a ton of KY jelly to lube up all the monsters. They also used mayonnaise, creamed corn, and microwaved bubble gum.
Ugh,
Uh,
it's disgusting. It keeps getting worse. It's like it was disgusting when I was watching it, and then once you figure out how it's made, you're like, oh, that's even worse.
Yeah, it's pretty foul. But I think this is better than the curdled milk that would have been on set for the Alien. Um,
Yeah, I don't know, Garrett. Like microwaved bubble gum?
I think that was more so for texture and stuff, but who
Yeah, I mean,
knows?
I praise their ingenuity in figuring this stuff out, but I also want to vomit.
Yeah. So a team of 35 people worked on these special effects. Rob Bottin had to hire in a couple other people to manage the team and another to do one of the big effects segments because they were hospitalized for exhaustion. Um, they claimed they were doing a lot of hoarding the work, so they wanted to work on a little bit of everything and oversee everything that was going on, and it just cost them too much um, of their like own time and well-being.
Hmm.
But one of the big design goals that he had was to not make it look like a guy in a suit. We've talked about like Star Trek before and all the aliens looking like people, and especially in the 1950s and 60s when all of these people that worked on the movie were growing up and being exposed to cinema and TV, every monster they saw was a guy in a suit. Like the creature from the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein, even Godzilla, like even those things, King Kong, they were all just guys in suits. Um,
Yeah, and that is for sure. This is not a guy in a suit. This is just disgusting. It's not even a dog in a suit.
No, it's puppets and people's arms and weird stuff. Um, for the scene where the guy's chest opens up and some hands plunge in there and get bitten off, they got the a person who was a double amputee to wear fake arms, so that way they would be ripped off in a more like convincing manner, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's interesting. And that harkens back to some of the early horror movies. I'm thinking of, oh gosh, what is it called? But there was an early horror movie that, this is not exactly, PC, but like they took a bunch of disabled people and had them like attack a town kind of a thing. And like, in that kind of like body horror genre. So, I mean, it's kind of cool to see that used in a different way that maybe is less exploitive and more creative.
Yeah, definitely this era of filmmaking, especially with these sort of effects, is based entirely on people being really creative. Um, Rob Bottin had basically free range over anything he wanted to do for the monsters and things. John Carpenter worked with him on like vision and ideas, and he was always a little bit afraid to suggest things because he didn't know how it would turn out. But they worked together to have a really cohesive vision of what was going on.
Yeah, and I think that while I didn't like any of this stuff, I'm not supposed to either. And I can appreciate it for it being artistic. I just wish it had been more polished. Maybe, the lighting was better and a little more nuanced. Because it's just so in your face and so like gruesome and gross and but again, I'm not the, premier audience of this thing either. Like they are not doing this for me. They're doing this for you
Why me?
because you're a gross boy.
Okay. Yeah, I would definitely agree. This is more of a man's movie, which is a really dumb thing to say, but like, yeah, it kind of is.
Yeah, I mean, there are people that like, dirt and mud, and, whatever, stereotypes, like whatever. I'm not that person. This was not made for me. Alien was. So, yeah. It also fits more into the B movie genre, which is something that, like, I've watched a lot of B movies and enjoyed some of them, but, in general, not my jam.
I mean, I like a good monster. I always think they're fun and creative, and a good representation of like nightmares and real primal fears. Like there's tons of spider legs that come out of the thing, like whenever it wants. Lots of like tentacles and then just like rows and rows of teeth. Like really like nightmare fuel stuff that I think works really well in making this a scary monster.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I can understand not liking it. It is very out there. It's not as like real as, like a slasher villain that's just like an insane person, but it's it's real in a way that it like taps into some really primal fears.
Yeah. Yeah.
Shall we move on to the legacy?
Yeah.
Okay. So you may be aware of the hit game Among Us, which is a game that really took uh, the gaming market by storm of being a bunch of people working on a spaceship, and then among them are traders, and your goal is to like find them out. This is that same idea that gets translated time and time again. The Thing has had this lasting legacy of having like its idea go on to tons and tons of different stories and media, comic books, and short stories and board games and video games. It really dominated all over the place, but it wasn't initially well received at all. Um, People complained of the nihilistic ending. That didn't test well. They made a alternative ending where only Kurt Russell survives, and that tested even less well. Um, as a result of this being like a commercial flop, John Carpenter lost work. Universal bought him out of a bunch of the contracts that he was signed on to make, and he was called a pornographer of violence. Really just dragged down a lot by the poor reception of this film.
Yeah, and
Uh,
that is too bad because like it does have good things, but I mean, as I've said several times, like there are a lot of things I don't like in this movie, and I think that the ending, like, okay, like
well,
I mean, it was fine.
what do you think of the ending?
Garrett, I am not gonna lie, I don't remember what happened. I watched
Okay,
this 3 days ago, and I don't remember what happened, which means that the ending kind of sucked.
okay, that's a perspective.
Like I remember Kurt Russell like staring at the fire like from outside like in his with his hair and like looking at the fire, but like did other people live?
Yes,
Okay, like the one black guy?
one of two. Yes.
Okay. Okay, well then I kind of remember, but like yeah, it was not memorable. Like the whole like last bit of the movie. I mean, so I part of it is because I was like thinking about how much it would suck to be in a building that was burning around you that you had just sat on fire because you decided to do it from the top down into the basement, which is dumb. You should always set the basement on fire first.
Well, they blew up the basement. Yeah,
Oh my.
but they did set the building on fire first. Yeah,
Yeah, this
okay.
was just
That's
bad. This was a bad idea. Like the execution of the like plan was bad. Like, yeah, it just ugh.
so
Yeah.
there was a TV cut of the film, and that was made by Universal executive Sidney Steinberg, who cut it down, made it acceptable for TV because this was rated R. This was a very visceral and violent movie for the time. And there was a new ending. Now, tell me what you think of this ending. The Thing escapes as another dog.
I mean, that's kind of fun.
I think that that undermines like a lot of this movie, but all right. Like,
So, like, do you assume that Kurt Russell and the other guy die before somebody gets there?
so in my mind, Kurt Russell is still Kurt Russell, but Childs has been absorbed. He is a thing.
Okay.
And they're going to sit there and they're going to freeze to death. And then there's going to be the rescue team that shows up in a few months or years to figure out what's going on. And then the thing spreads again. I think the thing becoming another dog is just boring because then it means you could just watch the movie again and it would, play out the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess like if that's the question, is the thing one of the people or is it a dog? One of the people is more fun. I kind of think that either nobody living or just Kurt Russell living is better. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, somebody should have workshopped this more because like could have been better.
So John Carpenter disavows the dog escaping as he thinks this version was made, kind of out of spite from the executives because this was their like original critique on the movie was the ending was too bleak,
Hmm.
um, which John Carpenter later like kind of agrees with, but yeah, I think it could have been better if nobody lived at all. I mean, as bleak as that would be, at least that was, hey, the thing is dead, not it probably lives on in another. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the success story of killing the thing is pretty nice.
yeah, I would think so because this is an absolutely terrifying movie monster. As far as like, really like terrifying and unstoppable monsters go, I think this is right up there with something like the Terminator. Like it's damn near impossible to kill and is almost unstoppable.
Yeah, and if we go to like some other genre of this kind of like monster movie like Tremors, like even though they've made like four Tremors sequels, like they do tend to kill the monster at the end of the movie. And there is a certain amount of goodwill and happiness because of that.
Yeah, they have heroic moments at the end usually. That was one of the things that even John Carpenter said this movie was lacking was like a heroic, theme to it. Like Kurt
Yeah.
Russell is only an action hero for a bit. He doesn't really save the day as gracefully as, he does in other movies, let's say.
Right, yeah. And I think that part of that is that there's no one for him to save because you don't really establish an emotional connection to anybody but the dogs.
That's true. The interpersonal relationships between the people on the station aren't like established hardly at all, which is really unfortunate because you really could have had a lot of like loyalties play into, oh, there's no way this person could have done this, or we're
Mhm.
all on the same side. You see that with Clark and his dogs, but that's about it.
Yeah, there was no like, oh, this guy's just like staring at pictures of his family that he's looking forward to getting back to, or, this guy's a vet and, he's been through this trauma, or like, yeah, nobody really had personality. Like, one guy smoked weed. Like, yeah, yeah,
Apparently, there were a few scenes that were cut that would have aided in this, but it only amounted to like 3 minutes of screen time, so I don't think it would have, been that great. Um, especially when we talk about Alien, like there are enough scenes at the beginning to like understand who all these characters are and how they interact with each other and like their relationships. Um, it's not really here.
yeah. And we also have the issue of a bunch of white dudes look like a bunch of white dudes, and it gets confusing pretty
The,
quickly.
it gets super confusing when they're all wearing giant parkas.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm glad I wasn't the only one who was completely lost there. And like,
Well,
yeah, I think that this movie would have been better if it had like half the cast involved. Like, why were there two doctors? You know, like let's just narrow it down to like five people, and it's a lot easier to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I definitely understand that perspective. Um,
Yeah.
I
And then Alien had two white dudes who were kind of in charge, two women crew, two engineers, and Ash the
yeah,
scientist. Like that's eight people. They all had unique costumes, they had unique personalities, they had backstories. Much better result.
yeah, I I agree that like, while this movie has a lot of good elements, it really struggles with the characters that we're supposed to root for. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I struggled so much with this movie because like there were so many things I didn't like and so many things I thought just could have been done a lot better. And it kind of let me down. And what also sucks is like I remember this as being like a movie that I liked, that I've seen in the past. And like I don't know if like I think this movie is the kind of movie that plays better in a group. So if you're sitting around with like four or five people, playing a board game or something, and you can watch it and like laugh at it or like jump and be scared or like talk about it, I think that makes for a better sitting of it. Because like I think there are a lot of stuff to talk about, but if you're just consuming it as a movie, it has some real flaws.
yeah, definitely as we've been talking about it, I think we pointed out several that I didn't really consider while I was watching it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to ruin it further for you, but
I don't think it's ruined at all. I still think it's a good movie. I enjoy it. I think it's fun. It's immensely creative. Do I think it's a masterpiece? No, but that's
yeah,
I think it's hard to make a masterpiece.
that's true. I mean, I do think that you've pointed out some of the positives that I was not seeing as I was watching it. And I think that, a lot of that has to come from like my perspective on, what this movie could have been if it was made in 2023 of like concerns about contagions and quarantines and like better special effects and better cinematography. And the music was very much in an 80s moment where it was a little bit too much, but I still liked it because there's synthesizers and organ sounds and I like that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And it also, it's kind of like a slow burn of a movie too. Like it starts off so slowly, even though it has an action scene very much in the early part of the movie. So, yeah, I don't know. Real pros and cons for me.
Yeah. Um, it's definitely a movie.
Yep, it sure is.
I don't have much more to add.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else constructive. It would probably be just droning on about the same 5 points I've made this whole thing. But thanks for putting together all that research. I think you've really brought in some additional information into this that, helped me like it a little more. But yeah, I think my opinion's pretty clear.
Well, we want to thank you all for tuning in this time. Hopefully you learned something, or perhaps you just enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah. I hope you enjoyed this one in our discussion of elements that make for a good horror movie, and you'll enjoy the rest of Spooktober or Spookytober, whatever we're gonna end up calling it. And if you have some recommendations for some horror movies or scary movies to watch, write them in the comments. We'd love to add them to our list as long as they're streaming at a streaming service that we already have access to.
Yeah, that's the hardest part of this is I don't want to fork out $5 every week to watch a movie.
Yeah, we're not paying to watch Poltergeist 2. It's not happening. So don't
No.
worry. Like yeah. But
Y-
I mean, lots of stuff's available. So, we'll watch some good movies. I have some good movies of some good ideas of some other horror movies that I hope will inspire some more really good conversation, especially around creativity with special effects, suspense, lighting, music, sound, storytelling, and character development.
Yeah, it's unfortunate this movie only has a few of those, but maybe we'll round out the year by covering good stuff in every movie.
Yeah. Okie dokes. Well, thanks for listening. Good night, everyone.
Goodbye.
That was the saddest goodbye, Garrett.
I'm sorry. I'll do a better one in post.
You don't have to, it worked.